Hello, everybody. My name is Jocelyne Cesari. I am a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center, and I'm a professor of religion and politics. And it's my really great pleasure and honor to host this session related to the launch of a new book on the significance of religion for the sustained development goals. That is the title of the book, which is also the agenda of the UN until 2030. So it's very relevant to discuss the book in the current global politics and the status of religion in it. And it's even more timely when we usually look at religion and global affairs, unfortunately, only through the angle of conflict and security, and forget or neglect the importance of religion for development in general, for safety of people, for growth, not only economically, but also socially. And so it's very important to see emerging new publication on religion that stay away from the only, what I call the only security angle. So I'm going to introduce the different speakers and each time say a little thing about them. So first, of course, Professor Christine Schließer. She's the author of the book. She's a senior lecturer at Zurich and Fribourg, and she will introduce the book, and then I will give the floor to the next speaker once you are done. And I think I will give you 10 minutes. Before I give the floor to you, I remember the audience that the session is recorded, and that you will be also able to access the recording sometimes a few days after we have finished and close up the session. So, Christine, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Jocelyn, for this kind introduction and for organizing this event. And thank you, everyone, for joining. I wish we could be there in person, but it's great to have you online as well. It is such a pleasure to be with you today. I highly value the Berkeley Center's unwavering commitment to multi-faith dialogue. The recent eruption of violence in the Near East that still shocks us shows the urgency of exactly this, that is, of different faith actors working together for overcoming hatred, violence, and injustice. And this is exactly what is at the core of the interreligious book series, Religion Matters, on the significance of religion for global issues, and of the volume that we present today on the significance of religion for the SDGs and introduction. I'm also tremendously grateful to my esteemed colleagues and dear friends who join me today, Dr. Azar Karam, Dr. Lisa Leroux, and Dr. Sandra Pertek. They each embody the vision of this interfaith book series, and they all have been involved in this particular volume and/or the series. The SDGs need a global rescue plan, said UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in his opening remarks to the SDG summit a little while ago in New York City. By this, the UN Secretary General draws attention to the fact that global crises that currently seem to follow one another in nearly breathtaking speed, including armed conflict, climate impacts, and the still ongoing effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, threaten the achievement of the SDGs by 2030. During the opening remarks of the SDG Summit, Mayada Adil of Sudan and young leader of the SDGs challenged the heads of states assembled. What have you done to include young people in decision-making space? I would like to add a second challenge. What have you done to include faith actors in decision-making space? This question speaks to the fact that 85% of this planet's population adhere to a faith tradition. This makes faith communities the largest transnational civil society actors. Religion impacts how people think, how they act, and how they don't act. It simply blows my mind, if I may say so, that this powerful force in shaping human action is still being neglected by the world's leaders, including the SDG Summit. You might want to guess how many times we find the terms faith or religion mentioned in the political declaration of the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. I guess you guessed correctly, 0 times. As if religion didn't exist, as if religion didn't matter for the SDGs, for peace, for justice. Against this, our entire book series and this volume claims religion matters. It holds on to the significance for the SDGs. Another premise of this book, and one that almost goes without saying in our context here, is the inherent ambivalence of religion. Each religion contains both problematic and constructive features. The way this book, and actually the entire series, is set out is to build bridges between the different spheres of engagement, to bring together the insights of academics, practitioners, and policymakers. This book therefore wants to be easily accessible, and it tries to avoid overly technical terms. And with only about 120 pages, it is comparatively short. And it is open access, so you can download it for free. The book is structured in 2 main parts. First, a shorter part is entitled The Rise of Religion in Development. There, I discuss the historical background that first led to the acknowledging of the impact of religion on development, and then towards tentative inclusion of faith actors in development, a process that is still ongoing. I want to draw your attention particularly to chapter 3, entitled Meet the Family, Religion's Different Phases in Development. There I introduce a 7-dimensional analytical model of reading religion right in different development contexts. This model is simple to use without being simplistic. And of course, I didn't come up with it all by myself, but I built on the work of other esteemed colleagues. In a second, more extensive part, I chose different SDGs to look at in more detail. For each of them, I applied the 7-dimensional model of analyzing the role of religion in this particular SDG. I discussed the role of religion in poverty alleviation, in health and education, as well as in gender equality, the reduction of inequality, climate action, and peace. And since I myself come from a Christian perspective, I asked other wonderful contributors who bring in a wealth of wisdom from different faith traditions for each of these chapters. Among the faith traditions represented are Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, and Native American perspectives. And I asked these colleagues to focus on a case study that illustrates the role of their faith tradition within the respective SDG, and that puts some flesh to the bone of the more analytical model. Another feature of this book, and well, actually of the entire series, is that each volume ends with a chapter on the practical implications for academics, practitioners, and policymakers. And for those of us who have limited time resources, so for every one of us, each volume starts with an executive summary, giving you all the key findings of the book at a glance. And it is through these key findings that I would like to take you now very briefly. And given the fact that you're all experts in this field, some of these findings might not be that shockingly new to you, while others might highlight a facet that is well worth being reminded of. I will share my screen briefly. Implication 1. Given the time limit, I will only comment on a few of them and not on every single one. Going beyond the binary, bridging the religious-secular divide. Implication 2. Reading religion right. 7 dimensions of religion. I mentioned this model already. The religious factor in development often remains vague and difficult to grasp. And there is, as a UNFPA paper points out, an ongoing need for shared analytical and definitional clarity when dealing with religion in developmental processes. For that matter, even for faith-based actors themselves, it can be difficult to explain just what exactly is their unique contribution. So these 7 dimensions are meant to shed light on this oftentimes vague religious factor. And they are religion as religioscape, community, teachings, spirituality, practice, institutions, and framework. Being aware of the potentials and, of course, the problems connected to each of these aspects can be tremendously helpful when trying to engage faith actors for the SDGs. 3, creating spaces of trust, the need for encounter between all relevant actors. I think what we are doing here is exactly what is needed much more. And of course, not only in the virtual realm, but also face-to-face. Implication 4, wanted, bilinguality, religious and developmental literacy. A few words on that. In order to mitigate the Babylonian confusion of tongues that inevitably arises in international, interdisciplinary, and cross-sectional settings, such as development work, all partners involved need to become bilingual, or even better, multilingual. Faith actors need to acquire development literacy, such as human rights language, while secular actors need skills in religious literacy. Implication 5, theology matters, why we need immanent critics. Learning human rights language is not enough for faith-based actors. Rather, the very idea of universal human rights needs to be made at home in each and every single faith tradition. Otherwise, human rights and the SDGs that arose from this very concept will always be in danger of remaining on the surface only. For the SDGs to become an integral part of everyone's DNA, we need theologians who speak critically and self-critically from within their own faith tradition. We need more of these immanent critics who do the crucial work of connecting their own faith tradition with the concerns of human rights and the SDGs. Implication 6. I'm almost finished. I have a total of 9 implications, so we're almost there. Women in focus. rethinking religious leadership. I think this one is self-explanatory. Implication 7, youth in focus. And what about social media? The importance of engaging the youth for sustainable development is undisputed. Yet it is all the more surprising that social media, which is one of the most effective tools for reaching the youth, I have 3 teenagers at home, so I see where they get their information from. So this still remains underused. Development actors must become much more efficient in utilizing social media for outreach to the youth on matters of faith and development. Implication 8, what good is this? Accountability and measuring impact. Again, much more work needs to be invested in the development of methods and frameworks for evaluation and impact measurement. This is necessary not only for strengthening the projects and initiatives on the field, but also for professional recognition, as well as for the communication and engagement with policymakers. Recent years have seen quite a bit of improvement, yet I think there still remains more to be done. And the final one, implication 9, one faith is not enough. The power of multi-faith engagement. I'd like to quote Asa Karam, ambitious goals and complex problems can best be tackled when different faith communities work together, unquote. And this holds especially true in the complexities of the field of global development. At least 2 implications follow. First, collaboration with faith-based actors often means focusing on the 3 Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. The insights and wisdom of other faith traditions, such as the indigenous or the Dharmic traditions, for example, need to be given much more consideration. And secondly, faith-based actors need to collaborate not only with secular actors, but also with each other, developing multi-religious narratives and engagement on the SDGs. So let me conclude with another statement by Asa Karam. Interreligious work is not optional, but absolutely necessary. With this, I will stop quoting Dr. Karam and hand over to her directly, as she is also one of the gracious contributors to this volume. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Christine. Before I give the floor to Dr. Karam, I want to remind the audience that you can ask questions through the Q&A at your leisure, and I will pick up the questions and channel them to the different participants. So, as you have just assumed, Dr. Karam is a key actor, not only in the book, but on the international scene when it comes to interfaith perspective and global affairs. She was the former Secretary General of the organization Religions for Peace, and she's a professor of religion and development at the Reich University in Amsterdam. I may not pronounce this correctly, but I mean well. So, Asa Karam, please, the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed. And I just want to say, first of all, Jocelyn, you have been a leader yourself in this space for a very long time indeed. So I just want to make sure to pay tribute to that. I also want to say that this is an absolutely lovely panel. It's all women, and it's women with a tremendous history of having engaged in this space for decades. And by the way, having worked in the UN for almost 20 years, A good 15 of those focused on the issue of engagement with religious actors. I can tell you that the leaders in this space inside the UN system from different UN agencies actually were majority women. And there might be something to think about and ponder that goes directly to what Professor Christine has mentioned, which is one of the many recommendations that she has very wisely suggested, which brings me to a sincere and deep appreciation. And it's not just a mutual admiration club, but a sincere and deep appreciation for Christine for stewarding a very necessary effort in knowledge management, in global knowledge management, in global legacy documentation, which, as we know as women, but also generally, frankly, with the understanding of history that seems so incredibly warped, documenting what takes place and becomes history is almost as important as the history and events themselves. So it's not a minor achievement that Christine has managed to steward a global initiative, which is this documentation and the legacy building of the work on the intersections of religions and development. And she deserves a very special recognition for that effort, which she's currently stewarding, in addition to obviously everything that she has said, the wisdom that she has compiled and referenced. So thank you, Christine, for your historic leadership effort in the knowledge and management of the space. Couple of points to share. By the way, I have the tremendous privilege now of serving as the president and CEO of the Women's Learning Partnership, which is actually, you all represent it brilliantly, which is how different women's human rights led and leadership efforts around the world, particularly in the global south, work together to learn from one another to enhance leadership for democracy and civic engagement globally. So this is a joy for me. It's an opportunity to harvest so much of the work of working with human rights actors around the world in the religious spaces and the multi-religious spaces, and now try to support women-led efforts more systematically and critically. A couple of, I think, three main points that actually will do nothing to add, because I think Christine's perspectives have been extremely comprehensive and she's raised the most important points. But if you'll allow me to be an agent provocateur a little bit, to provoke a little bit, you know I'm used to this, you're used to me being used to this, so bear with me for a few more minutes. Three key points. The first point has to do with what Professor Christine very logically appreciated and highlighted, which is the continued lack of appreciation and, if you will, perceived division between the secular and the religious international development spaces when it comes to, obviously, conversations around an engagement with sustainable development goals. And she asked a very, very important question. She said, what have we done to include faith leaders in this international Sustainable Development Goals agenda space? And I just wanted to say that one of the things that remains improperly understood is this legacy of how the United Nations system, not just one or two agencies, but the United Nations system has actually been engaging with diverse faith actors for decades. This understanding, this historical document that says, here's what the different UN entities have been doing as part of the UN system, have been doing in engaging with religious actors, at least since 2000, but quite frankly, for long before. That history I tried to write, but it is not out there in the public domain. But that history needs to be appreciated and understood because it has existed. The fact that we do not know about it does not mean that it has not happened. It simply means that our level of knowledge has yet to be updated, shall we say, because there is a decades-long engagement of the United Nations system with diverse religious actors. Fact. What that is, we could do with some enlightenment about it. But I just wanted to point that for the record, because again, it's about how history comes and tells us what the story is. And frankly, right now, it's an incomplete story. Doesn't mean that it never happened. It's just an incomplete story. That's point number one. Point number two, I think it would be very helpful to know that there are actually lessons learned from this history of engaging the United Nations system of engagement with religious actors. There's actually some lessons learned in this space, which Professor Christine has already elaborated to some extent, but not necessarily as lessons learned from that history, where in fact it is. Some of them are very much lessons learned. For instance, the understanding that women as key agents of change in this space, and indeed proven to be such, is there. It's actually there. So those of us who have engaged for decades with different kinds of religious actors see, know, and have even tried to contribute to that domain, where women's leadership has been absolutely essential in highlighting certain scientific truths, but also in undertaking some very critical knowledge work and in stewarding some very pragmatic programs and initiatives around them. The women, some of them are right here on this screen. So there's actually been some lessons learned from this. But another very valuable lesson learned that I think we should not overestimate or underestimate is the reality that when the global pandemic impacted, and it impacted on the world, it was a universal situation. When that happened, the way in which different religions and the international development system collaborated was weak at best. Not because there wasn't enough to do, but simply because the normal that Professor Christine has already mentioned, that the fact that it's still not normal to work together, either as UN system entities or as faith-based organizations and different kinds of religious actors. It's still not normal to work together. What is normal, and this is a very real and very sad aspect, what is normal in the realms of the intersection of religions and international development is the following. One, each to his own. Each NGO, each religious organization, FBO, each religious leader and his institution to his own. The territoriality and competitiveness between the faith-based actors and organizations is intense. The territoriality and competitiveness within the international development system, the so-called secular, is intense. And as long as the normal is the territoriality and competitiveness, we can talk until we're blue in the face about multi-religious, collaborative, partnership, etc. Unfortunately, even the faith-based world operates just like any other secular space, and it is territorial, it is competitive. Fact. This is a reality we must come to terms with because it has very clear implications on the very concrete recommendation made by Dr. Christine. A third and my last point is this. It's very important for us to keep into account another reality, which is that as long as we shy away from dealing with some very sensitive issues, whether they are related to sexuality, whether they are related to territory or land, whether they are related to political ideologies, as long as we shy away from actually tackling some of this, we are also ignoring another glaring reality that we are actually living the consequences of right now. And that is that height of misogyny and misogynistic practices globally that also has to do with and is intimately and intricately connected with war as the most viable option for most leaders around the world today. We are living in a moment in time in which we have gone back, as far as I'm concerned, to way beyond the Middle Ages, where the average leader seems to think that war is a very fine idea. It's absolutely necessary. We have to go to war. And we have to go to war. And it just seems to be a coincidence that we also have the highest levels of misogynistic practices ever in our modern history. This trend of going to war and hate speech as language is normal, this trend we have to start tackling very clearly. We cannot speak about what we need to do with different religious and secular spaces without acknowledging that the truth is that right now, as the normal practice is to go to war, as the normal practice is to be misogynistic, It's also the case that the strongest alliances between certain religions and certain political spaces is happening. In other words, there is perhaps a coincidence that right now there are very powerful alliances between religious and political actors, and there is war that is a normal, and there is misogyny that is normal. If we don't take responsibility for that coincidence, we will not be talking very practically about what needs to be done. And those are very sensitive issues on almost every level, but those are issues that we have to come to terms with if we're genuine about implementing the very necessary recommendations. We are not talking about secular space on one side and religious spaces on the other. I'm very sorry, but we are not. We are talking about the confluence of religion and politics and religion that is also leading to a normalization of the language and practice and discourse of war and the intensity of misogyny. That is our normal today. And if we want to talk about how religions can be a force for good, we have to look at how religions and politicians and political actors are right now actually making life pretty darn miserable for almost everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Ada. I'm now turning to Sandra Iman-Pertek. With my colleague at the University of Birmingham. She's there, a postdoc fellow running a project on displacement and women in the Middle East. And Sandra, you have the floor for less than 10 minutes, I understand.
Yes. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be with you and all distinguished guests and speakers. Indeed, I run a project on protecting forcibly displaced women in the Muslim world. So I will be talking about specific spotlight analysis I contributed to Professor Christine's book. It's titled Gender Equality and Violence Against Women and Girls in Muslim Settings. And I'll be talking specifically focusing on SDG 5, which is to achieve gender equality and empower women, all women and girls, and end violence against women and girls. So today, I would like to humbly shed light on 3 points from the spotlight analysis, and I encourage you to read them. These are just 4 pages. I will be reflecting based on my professional experience in humanitarian sector, on the faith-based sector, as well as academic elaborations for the last 5 years. So I will be talking about religious analysis, then looking at the wider landscape, and then sharing some recommendations. So to start off, I would like to refer to my experience of attending a landmark international conference on women and Islam last week in Jeddah. This was an amazing space where high-level representatives from Muslim-majority countries and OIC-associated organizations came together. And I realized as I was sitting there that most speakers in all their diversity from across the Muslim world, from Indonesia to Suriname, talked about Islamic case for gender equality and Islamic case against violence against women and girls. Regardless of their religiosity levels, regardless whether they would promote secular or religious approaches to different issues, they would all refer to these cases of Islam as being a proponent of women's rights. And they would be saying that what we witness nowadays in the current global affairs is a regression and going against religious teachings. So clearly they referred to a compelling Islamic case against gender injustice, and I write about this a little bit in the spotlight. And now I would like to question, so what went wrong if the gender equality case is there in some religions? Why gender inequality persists despite, in my case of this paper, Islam's strong anti-gender inequality and anti-violence against women and girls message from the 7th century. So as we know, there are so many factors, and we could talk about internal and external factors. I will start from internal ones from within religion, and then I will briefly discuss wider socioeconomic factors. So first, I need to acknowledge there are diverse branches and schools of thought in Islam. This is a very diverse religion, and there is a spectrum of religious positionality and different categories. Some categories may appear binary. So we may think some people are more progressive, others more conservative with regards to women's issues. But in reality, I would think that these are fluid and blurred boundaries of people's positionality of their religious opinions, because sometimes people mix and adapt their progressive and conservative views to evolving conditions, and it will vary according to social identities at play. So people might be conservative at some issues and progressive in others, and vice versa. Obviously, there are problematic exigencies in diverse socio-political conditions, leading to diverse socially constructed religious manifestations, which may make gender inequality worse in some places than others. And this ambiguous religious understandings continue to be misused to sanction women, and even use interpretations that are against religious teachings to enforce discriminatory laws. As religion carries power, people use power to justify their own ends and to justify certain policies. And this is not surprising. Obviously, people's religion relies on their own subjective experiences and feelings, and some people may be associating gender norms with divine orders, intertwining gender and religion daily. So there are diverse gender dynamics in faith communities that originate from a context-specific understanding of the cosmological order, which may appear to insiders as natural conditions of existence, and as they are reinforcing them as a product of these conditions in real life. So questioning gender inequalities from within faith communities, wherever we are, might be difficult. Therefore, as gender dynamics are normalized by communities socialized in such conditions. So I think we all need to take, obviously, a look outside of our own conditions. We require to have role models, and there are many faith-inspired advocates who often use Quranic revelations, which outline women's rights to self-determination, to claim Islam as theoretically emancipating women in revolutionary ways centuries before feminist movements began. So there are some voices of women and activists who will claim so, and they would say that feminism and Islam are not mutually excluding each other. They are going pair in pair. They refer to scriptural values of social justice, human dignity, equality, solidarity, and partnership in family as commonly recognized key Quranic principles. And Muslim scholars challenge problematic hermeneutics with the independent examination of religious sources, undertaking that so-called ijtihad in Arabic, and independent reading of the Quran and interpretation, so-called tafsir. Also, Muslim educators often resort to the examples of prophets, monotheistic prophets, and Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as the best women's rights advocate. They refer, in doing so, to intersectional elements of gender and racial equality between people, drawing on the Quranic teachings. And they refer to women as well as playing a very important role in narrating Islamic sources in Islamic tradition. However, in brief, translating Islam's gender ethics into real life remains challenging in the Muslim world currently, as we see in the sustained high gender inequality rates. So what else fits to this situation? Lived religious experiences obviously do not exist in vacuum, and they are constantly renegotiated in the social world by external factors such as geopolitical and socioeconomic conditions. So here I would like to point out three factors. First of all, which perpetuate gender inequality across Muslim world. I would first of all mention high general and religious illiteracy, which often entail lack of awareness of women's rights and gender inequalities that go hand in hand. So general and religious illiteracy, general illiteracy going hand in hand. The second are high prevalence of conflicts that intensify patriarchal power imbalances and religious misinterpretations. We often hear about a backlash against women's rights, unsurprisingly, in the conflict-torn countries where politicized, co-opted, and misogynist religious expressions grow as a weapon of war to gain control. And finally, women are subjected to conflict-related sexual violence and different forms of violence, but also in peacetime, they are subjected to multiple oppression, such one is Islamophobia, where Muslim women are presented as oppressed and Muslim men are presented as oppressive misogynies, complicating even further framing inequality and violence against women and girls in Islam. So 3 quick recommendations. 1, to raise awareness of the Islamic pro-women ethics of protection and inclusion to ensure that women's rights are better understood. Second is to raise literacy levels, education as a crucial stepping stone to ending violence against women in faith communities. And most importantly, I call to account for local Muslim women's voices on the roles of religion in their lives. And for practitioners, I hope we could develop new gender conflict and religious analysis for effective strategy development. Thank you for that. I will pass over to next speaker.
Thank you very much, Sandra. So now I give the floor to Elisabeth Leroux, who is joining us from South Africa, if I am not mistaken, where she is the research director at the University of Stellenbosch. If I pronounce also, I hope not too badly. So Elisabeth, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn and everyone. It's such a privilege to be with you. Well, tonight for me, but this morning for most of you, I'm guessing. So I've been asked to speak on SDG 5, so a Sustainable Development Goal focused on gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls from a Christian perspective, drawing on the research that I've been doing for almost 20 years in different parts of the world, different religious settings, around religion, that intersection between religion, culture, and gendered violence. So there's so much that I could say, much more than I can fit into 10 minutes. So I decided to focus on one particular aspect that has emerged for me repeatedly, irrespective of the setting where I've worked, religious or cultural setting, or the specific form of violence against women and girls that I've studied, or the issue around gender equality. And it's something that I think is relevant for us to reflect on in terms of all the SDGs and our efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And that is the enmeshedness, the entanglement, because I don't actually know if enmeshedness is a real English word, this entanglement of religion and culture and what it means for our attempts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. I think there's often a quite simplistic understanding of the role of religion in gender equality or gender inequality, and the violence that results from gender inequality. But what I've seen, and repeatedly and in very different settings globally, is that religion and culture are intertwined in complex ways, and that this impacts how we should and how we can work with religious communities in our attempts to achieve gender equality. So maybe looking at this now from a Christian perspective, many Christians claim that their religious ideas or the content of their belief is divinely inspired and required, and it's autonomous and it's never changing. But the reality is that religion and culture are entangled and mutually influencing. So religious ideas are often heavily influenced by culture and in turn influence our culture. So for example, if we think about the Bible, if we think about scripture, we see there are multiple scriptures and scriptural interpretations of the Bible that can be read to justify and call for gender equality. Yet in many churches, these pieces of scripture are not read. So, and there's a choice is made to read biblical scriptures that, for example, state that men should be subservient, that women should be subservient to men. And these are repeatedly read and repeatedly preached on. So much research has been done on how the choice of scripture and the type of interpretation is heavily influenced by culture. And another example of this entanglement of religion and culture is where religious ideas are used to justify harmful practices that result from, but also in turn strengthen gender inequality. So, for example, where the biblical emphasis on purity and chastity of women is used to justify female genital mutilation and cutting. So what we see is that religious actors at times refute these kinds of examples by saying that it's not true religion. So the view is that if religion could be purified and stripped of this cultural influence, then these harmful beliefs and practices will no longer be promoted or condoned in religious spaces. But and it's not only me, we see other researchers and research pieces explore this, is that this is not really a valid argument. So there are so many examples of how religion has negatively impacted culture, influencing it in such a way that it ensures the subservient position of women. So, for example, we see in southern Nigeria, it's on the record how ancient Judaic practices, as recorded in the Bible, really influenced Christian Nigeria to the extent that women are now required to marry within their father's clan, and that gender differentiated access to land and property has become the norm. We also see Christian missionaries in Africa, and we see this the research on this, how they were complicit in changing pre-colonial gender relations that were gender equal. So using biblical scriptures to promote women's cultural insubordination. So, for example, a literal interpretation of the story of Adam and Eve was used to cement this idea of women being inferior, and that both men and women must accept this oppression. So I would argue that it attempts to identify the real culprits. So in gender equality, is it culture? Is it religion? If we try and do that, we ignore the reality that religion and culture are inherently entangled and mutually influence one another. And Maluleke and Haddad, they talk about the unholy trinity of religion, culture, and gender socialization, and how it drives violence against women and girls. Now, speaking specifically from an African Christian setting, Musimbi Konyora, she argues it so eloquently in her work, but she says that this idea that one could live by the gospel without culture is a belief, and I'm quoting now, held with much wishful thinking. There is no sphere of existence that is excluded from the double grip of culture and religion. Now, I can understand that it might seem that I'm going a bit off topic with this. You know, I'm asked to speak on a Christian perspective on the SDG 5. Why have I chosen to speak on this entanglement of religion and culture? And I've done so because I think we underestimate how contextual our understanding the motivations for gender inequality are. So I believe if we want to achieve SDG 5, if we want to work towards gender equality and women's empowerment, I do believe that we need to engage with religion, definitely, yes. But we need to engage with religion in its specific forms and context. So a Christian community in rural Senegal is not the same as a Christian community in Lima in Peru. And that's not the same as a refugee Christian community in the Netherlands. So I think this is a call for all of us in taking religion into account with achieving SDG 5, to not use a blanket one-size-fits-all approach to religion. Not even when we're working with one religion. You know, Christianity is not the same in every setting in the world. Rather, we do need to respect where we are, and that the specific nuances of religion in that setting as influenced by culture. Thank you for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to our discussions the rest of tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. So I'm going to take a few minutes to try to bring a few points that came across all the presentations, and then we open the floor to the audience who has posted a few questions, actually. So from all your talks, two things came very strongly across. One is to stay away from the binary between secular and religious. And I would add also, because it's in the same orientation, what just Elizabeth said, because culture depends where how you look, but it's also part of this binary. And that's a very important point. That's the most challenging we are having, not only in academia, but especially in the policy-making world. What I see is a strict, sharp divide of work, with the religious dealing with the spiritual and the secular politics dealing with the nitty-gritty of social economic issues, while the reality doesn't reflect this divide, and that the religious actors, communities are the most efficient when they deal with communal issues, not with the soul only, or only the soul and the spirituality of the followers. The role of religion in politics or in global development is not about spirituality as such. It is about the communal responsibility of lots of members of community. And I would say I insist a lot on this, and I reinforce the point made by Azza Karam. The role of religion in politics and in global development is not about the development, the spirituality of people only. It is about engaging with challenging social issues, and who do that? Mostly members of congregation, not the clerics there, but the people in the congregation, especially women. And I think that's an important point to make here. But people coming from international organizations with a secular background tend to turn to the cleric to understand the role of religion in global development. And that's why they are missing a lot of opportunities here. At the same time, we have to turn also the mirror around. Lots of religious actors do not feel comfortable talking about their religious engagement vis-a-vis the overall community, in the sense that they are always concerned that they're going to be misunderstood or misinterpreted. And sometimes also, that's why I like the point you made on bilingual, these religious actors do not have the language to talk within the secular parameters of global development. So I think there is a lot of challenges here, but in other words, policymakers should not be afraid of religion. And I think it's also a responsibility of members of religious communities to make clear that what they are doing is not theological work as such, but communal work. And that's an important point. But this goes to the second element that was in Sandra and also in Christine's point. Theology matters, yes, but theology, as Elizabeth said, in context. Because if you just say theology and look at interpretation from a doctrinal approach, you lose the context. And like you have seen, Elizabeth, even theology changes from one context to another. And the way, especially the gender issues are addressed, and this I follow you completely on that, Elizabeth, is very much rooted in the context as it is in the theology itself. So theology, yes, but in context. And unless you want maybe to respond briefly on that, I have questions that will allow you to follow up on just what I said, because the two sets of questions I have identified. Let me see if why can I not? open. There were questions indeed of how does theology matters. Lots of them come on this, and with references to some authors. And there was also, now I don't know why I cannot access all the open questions, but let's see. There were also some questions on some NGO and the role they may play, like NGO No 120 Global Hunger. I don't know what this is. There are some kind of very precise questions on NGOs. And there was also a very punctual question to Sandra, if you could put in the chat. I don't know if everybody can get access to the chat, or maybe respond to the question on the conference you attended on women and Islam. And there is also one question on the critical role of John Paul, the Pope John Paul. So I'll let you, if you want, I would like to hear all of you on this theology aspect and how it matters.
Maybe I go ahead and start. Thanks very much for these wonderful contributions. You all raised really important points. And actually, as I was listening to every one of you, something very similar came to my mind, because one point I think that connects each and every of your contribution is actually the link between theology and hermeneutics and actions. And this is also one thing I try to point out in my book, that yes, the individual theological perspective is of importance, especially when it is combined with problematic hermeneutics. But then I try to focus also on the actions undertaken, the experiences of engagement, and also some concrete recommendations. For example, Asa, you mentioned the current sensitive issues that we need to address, and you also pointed to the unholy alliances between religious leaders and the conflict and war that is currently going on. And I'm thinking, for example, of Cyril and his justification of the war that is going on in Ukraine. And I think this shows very clearly the connection between a problematic theology, a problematic hermeneutical reading of a holy scripture, in this case of the Bible, and very concrete action that results from that, very highly disturbing consequences. So this link between the individual hermeneutical perspective and the concrete actions that follow from that, I gathered that as being present in all of your contributions.
Any of you want to follow up on some of these questions?
Yes, if I may,
Yes.
I think
Please.
questions showcase part of the challenge of understanding where religions and international development, as exemplified by the SDGs, the challenge of even understanding that space, that for some rooted in different religious theologies, the approach or the understanding, as Jocelyn, you said it very well, seems to be more about how is the spiritual or the theological actually being dealt with or influencing some of this space. And for others, especially those who come from a very policy-making, secular, international development perspective, the question is, what exactly do religions have to do with SDGs? You know, what is it that, what practically do they do? And I can tell you from working in the UN context, where it's a largely secular, obviously, space, the that was precisely the question that was asked. Nobody cared so much about the theologies. What does Islam say? What does Christianity say, etc., but more about why, what exactly is the concrete contribution of religious communities to sustainable development goals as they are today? Like what is the concrete contribution? And that was actually the way that this conversation started in the United Nations, to try to get interest from the secular spaces, whether governmental or intergovernmental, to look at how religions matter. It was not by saying, look, Islam says this and Christianity says that and Judaism says this. It wasn't by doing that, because we would have lost everybody's attention in less than half a minute. But it was about saying, do you know that faith-based NGOs are actually contributing this % of services in the public health space, in the educational space, in the etc., by just actually showcasing how significant and foundational the roles of religious institutions and religious NGOs are in serving this international development space, and showing how actually the original development actors were religious institutions and foundations. So it wasn't like, oh, gee, the secular word discovered development. It was about just showcasing some of the data and the statistics and the realities of how organizations serve already, religious organizations serve in that space. But we still tend to look at it from that very bifurcated space. Do we need religious literacy, or do we need policy literacy? Well, quite frankly, I don't think it's that clear cut, because when we speak about religious literacy, we're not talking about what does Islam say about issue X, issue Y, issue Z, issue A, because that will take us forever. And that's not something that secular program development people are going to have the capacity to completely appreciate. That's what theologians and people working in the religious spaces can do. And that's the role of those who translate, such as Dr. Sandra and Dr. Elizabeth. Do they translate some of the theological implications and how they relate to the practical policies? That's the role of translators. But you can't expect every single person working in government to be very well versed in how every single religion actually discusses and speaks to every single aspect of life, because international sustainable development is precisely every single aspect of life. You can't expect that, nor can you expect the theologians and the religious leaders to know about how all the other religions impact and relate to every single aspect of sustainable development. We have the role of those who translate in the midst to the two. And it's not one set of literacies that would be taught to one or the other. I think we have to be very, very careful that when we speak about the kind of literacy, knowledge that is required in the intersection between religions and politics, and especially policies of sustainable development, we're talking about actually understanding how it is that religious communities and organizations contribute to the sustainable development goals, and actually understanding how the sustainable development goals are part and parcel of the lived existence and understanding of different religious communities and organizations. That's a very different kind of literacy. And it also applies, by the way, to politics. How is it that foreign policy, as Professor Christine again said, how is it that right now we have a war going on? It's not just in Ukraine and Russia, it's actually also in Israel and Palestine, which has led to a warped understanding of this whole issue of Palestine being a Muslim issue, which I don't know where that came from, but it was never that case, and it never will be that case. So, but we have this very warped understanding of religions and the way that they're impacting on foreign policy. What we need to understand is not what Islam says, not what Christianity says, or even not what Judaism says. It's about how are these dimensions relating very concretely to the politics, policies, and actual engagement on the ground that is taking place as we speak. It's that kind of literacy as opposed to the theologies. That's something that theologians are much better equipped to do. So some people who've asked the questions on this Q&A, remarkable, wise, very wise questions. Actually, perhaps you are best equipped to answer them, since you seem to be speaking from a theological background yourselves. What would your answer be, frankly, rather than come to those who are trying to study that intersection and are not theologians themselves, but who are trying to look at the practicalities of how this stuff rolls out. I also want to make, one more point. Let us never, please, let us avoid making the mistake of assuming that the religious actors in their remarkable diversity don't know about human rights. The original human rights defenders who have paid with their lives have been religious actors. They have been priests, they have been nuns, they have been imams, they have been rabbis. Till today, some of the most active human rights defenders are religious leaders, and some religious actors. You cannot tell me that Pope Francis doesn't do human rights, doesn't speak to human rights discourse. He definitely does, as does the Imam of Al-Azhar. If you read the document on fraternity developed between the two of them, it's about aspects of human rights. So it's not that the space is so clear. Secular is human rights and religious is theologies of different religions. Human rights defenders have been, are, and will be religious actors too. And that's precisely what makes the human rights space so important for the discussions about intersectionality, to answer the question raised by one of the participants. Intersectionality means we have to look at where there is already an overlap in understanding and in praxis between the two. So let's honor those who have given their lives and are giving their lives to human rights, to defense of human rights, and to upholding human rights already within the religious spaces, and even using clear religious language. That space has to be acknowledged and honored. We're not going to begin it, and we're not instigating it from scratch. So let's please keep that aspect in mind very well. Thank you.
Thank you, Azza. This is a very important point. Indeed, to remind people that there is a discourse of human rights within any religious tradition, and there is recognition of individual agency and initiative in all religious tradition. And you're absolutely right that most secular policymakers, either national or international, start with a priori that's not the case, that there is a sort of ignorance or blind spot of religious tradition vis-a-vis human rights and individual rights. I insist on that a lot because it's about agency and capacity of people to make choice in difficult conditions. And the first community that provided responses to that were religious communities, not political communities. And it's too long to expand on that, but that's a reality of his story. So any other comment on that from Sandra or Elizabeth? Because I have lots of other questions that are here.
Just a comment on lived theology, if I may. So I would like to just refer to the studies I've done in forced migration settings and the stories I heard from survivors of treacherous journeys, refugee journeys, and survivors of sexual gender-based violence. So they were talking about theology as a lived experience. They would be often saying that migration experience would test their understanding of theology, and also the theology would be enriched throughout the processes of migration. This is very interesting, and I really like this point because it points us to the individual aspect of religion, of theology, of the fluidity and the continued evolution of theology, I think, in our lives. And those people, the women mainly that I met in my studies of my forced migration, they would rely on their religious beliefs, religious practices to survive and unspeakable hardships. They would really make so much sense from the history, from the stories of the Bible, from stories from the Quran, and it would just keep them going through unspeakable hardship, through all different things, including torture, sexual violence, trafficking, and all that. I think this is, well, obviously a very specific scenario, but I think this also relates to our own lives in everyday. All different leaders, they do have some spiritual experiences, and these experiences I reflect on, particularly when I visit the sacred spaces such as Mecca, for example. This is a very powerful place where people seek spiritual transformation, and they do use the spaces to recharge and to re-energize themselves to continue their daily work, whatever their occupations are, whether they fight on for global peace, or whether they are serving children in schools in their local communities. whatever people's professions are, spiritual experiences, I think, are those source of powers and transformation that can change the world and can transform and heal it. Just a short comment on intersectionality. I already responded to it written in the chat. I don't know if the person who asked this question received that, but I do think intersectionality enables us to account for wider factors than religion and culture. Religion and culture, it's one nexus, but there are many other nexuses that we should take account of, including identities, politics, power, and other things that either marginalize people or empower them in certain cases. And just wanted to recall one story of woman I met in Ankara. There was a Syrian woman who would confidently argue that there is no distinction for them between culture and religion, and they would be very firm in saying, in differentiating what is religious and what cultural. And this is just something that brings new to my understanding and many studies I've done, that maybe there is something about it. Maybe there is something to separate between religion and culture. Maybe this is something that maybe this is not entirely connected. Maybe there is maybe we should also listen to these women's voices, and if they think this is culture and religion, there's an important recognition. Well, this is specific for programming and all the humanitarian programs or welfare programs to protect women. I will pass over to colleagues. I'm sure there are many other comments. I will stop here.
Yes, Elizabeth, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to add on to what Sandra has been saying, and she and I, we've discussed this a lot and spoken about it a lot. And it's also maybe, I think, continuing from what Azza was saying, but let me try and find my words. I think within our international development space, and it's been for decades, a recognition of religious actors and religious networks and religious spaces and their role in international development in achieving development goals, even when it was like the original ones, the Millennial Development Goals. I think we've seen an evolving of that understanding of this role. Way back, I can remember. I think it was WHO no, it was World Food Program in Lesotho, and you would see their bags of maize everywhere being distributed by the churches. So our religious actors being in these really practical roles, utilizing their trust in the community, utilizing their spaces, utilizing their networks, their hierarchies. I think what Sandra was now referring to in these lived experiences and lived religious experiences, I think there is room, and I think we are seeing this in challenging these accepted boundaries of what it is that religion and religious actors and religious spaces offer our development goals. I think, for example, and Sandra's research itself is really challenging this around the role of religion and religious experiences. So reading of sacred texts, prayers, dreams, the role that plays in mental health and psychosocial support. And we really see that with survivors, with refugees, with forced migration. And I think there is a challenging of our understanding of what it is that religions inherently offer, but what connects to its theological content in a way. So there's a challenge of that divide, I think. And speaking, I think, as a researcher that works with practitioners all the time, and in that space, I think this is an important challenging that happens for a more thorough understanding of what it is that religions offer to people. But I might be getting sidetracked on the slide points that I shall now stop. Thank you.
Thank you. For the sake of moving the conversation in other directions, so Sandra and Elizabeth, you just insisted a lot on the personal benefit of religion. And this, we have lots of surveys that show that in any circumstances, people who are religious are more resilient, healthier, and happier than the average. So here what you are showing is also that in case of duress, religion is an asset and not an impediment, which is indeed something that secular organizations on the ground do not take systematically into account. And that's something that has to be said to this people. And I have never heard any discussion on that in any kind of international forum. And that's why I think scholars who work on religion are key in this discussion. The second element, this goes back to the more global role. I think we also tend to disconnect the local, the national, and the global, while they are very, very much intertwined. And again, if we look today at the role of religious actors globally, what saddens me is that they all come from very national background. And it was said at some point or another, they are talking with the background of national cultures. The only one that doesn't do that is actually Pope Francis, to go back. He is the only one that has the capacity now to posit religion as a global moral force. If you listen to all other religious authorities, even at the one that emerged internationally, they talk from national perspective. And that's part of the limitation. And actually, indeed, we are witnessing in the current Gaza-Israel conflict a typical national interest in which religion is unmatched, but it is national. And that's, I think, if we look also, if we want to be clear on what religious actors do, we have to be clear that even if they posit themselves globally, they carry a national culture. And I work with lots of young religious leaders across tradition. That's why lots of them are interested in what the Pope Francis said. And the majority I work with has nothing to do with Catholicism, because and here we see the role of theology. He's also issuing encyclical and triggering a theological debate on that. And I think that's where things may open up for religion, in the sense that the pandemic has opened a window of opportunity for religious actors and community internationally. But I think the window is closing because most of the religious authorities do not remove, I would say, the clothing of the national wrapping they appear on. And I think it's a shame. Or missed opportunity, to be I think we have a couple of more questions. Yes, Christine, please.
If I may just very briefly respond to that. I really appreciate the point you're making by illustrating how, in this case, one particular religious figure, Pope Francis, how in his case, the different dimensions of religion actually come together. On the one hand, the global perspective, but then the very particular rootedness, then the spirituality dimension that that he manages to connect to people who follow his own particular faith, but then also the the emphasis, Asa, you emphasized especially the output, basically, the different projects, the achievements of faith-based actors. You can clearly see that in what Pope Francis is trying to do, emphasizing the importance of peace networks, of education networks, of healthcare. So there you have, as one example, the different dimensions being tied together. And I would caution of trying to play out one dimension against the other. I wouldn't set the practicalities of religion against the spirituality of religion, or theology against concrete projects and outputs. And I think, and I'd like to come back, Asa, to your point on the importance of translators. This is exactly the competency that is required of translators. They speak into the community of the believing, into the faith communities, by means of connecting to the teaching, to the spirituality, to practice. But they can also manage to translate, and they speak into the community of policymakers by means of evidence-based language, the practice output, or the networking output. So in the person of the translator, and perhaps Pope Francis might be called a translator, a mediator, these different dimensions of religion actually come together. And I think it's important actually to keep these dimensions together and not to try to play out one against the other.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Make
Trying to- Yes, please go ahead, Asa.
underline what Professor Schlieser has just said, because it is so important that we don't see them as distinct and separate. In fact, we've been talking so much already, and one of the questions was about the intersectionality. There's so much, and you've mentioned this yourself, there's so much intertwining that's taking place, and it is very important to see that. But it's also very important to see the uniqueness of each of their roles, of the religious theology, so that we don't assume that all theology is policy and all policy is theology. I think it's important to see those intersectionalities by all means and absolutely, but also to recognize and give due recognition and respect to the individual spaces and disciplines and actions. One thing I want to point to all of you, already you have noted the Pope. I was one of the first to bring that up, but can I please say he's not the only one who speaks for how religious theology is very much a pragmatic call to action with clear policy implementations. You all know him because he's reported on most extensively in Western media. But with all due respect, there are so many religious leaders existing today, some of them women, who are also talking from different theological perspectives and marrying that political, practical policy implication and actions a great deal. They may not all be speaking English. They most definitely do not get reported on as extensively as His Holiness Pope Francis. It doesn't mean that they don't exist, and it doesn't make him the unique one. One of the most frustrating things for me, having served global interreligious spaces where leaders and NGOs are very much active, was to keep noticing how it was when the Pope said something that it became, oh, gee, look at that, he's spoken, oh my goodness. And yet 100 religious leaders, literally 100 religious leaders from all religions around the world would have said the same thing a week before in a public statement, and nobody noticed. Nobody noticed. It didn't come to anybody's attention. So please, let's be a bit cognizant of the fact that when we speak and think in English and relate in Western languages, we actually are missing out on a lot of what is taking place around the world. And that also means the voices of human rights defenders, women leaders, but also male religious leaders who are incredibly important in what they're saying. Even my dog is upset in what they're saying. So please, let's just keep that humility a bit in mind. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ava. That's a very important point. First, indeed, these religious leaders exist. And again, there's a question of translation. As you said, they may not articulate in English what is said. Unfortunately, the language of the international order is English. So there is a role here of scholars or mediators to do this job. And I'm not sure that we are doing it, one. Second, it is not only a mediatic role. I have seen that now the Pope Francis is taken seriously on issues like climate change. To my knowledge, was he the only one invited to the Paris conference for the climate change and global warming?
Oh, Jocelyn, the Imam of Al-Azhar and a few other religious leaders were equally invited, and they indeed did show up, and many of them are going to be showing up. So it's not only
Yeah,
him.
but the problem of Imam Al-Azhar is doesn't have a global voice. I'm sorry, he is the voice of Egypt.
No.
And that's the problem.
Second, the Imam of Al-Azhar is the Imam of Al-Azhar. You also have another person who was mentioned in the questions. It's the Aga Khan. There are a number of different religious
Yeah,
Muslims.
but Aga Khan and the Imam of Al-Azhar are not the same. And that's the problem when you have religious voices constricted by national problem.
By national, I think that's a reading. That's a reading of his role, a reading of his role. But I think we have to understand that the Catholic priest.
We have to agree to disagree on that. It's not a reading. He is paid by the Egyptian state, and he has to say things that are conform with the Egyptian policy, which is not the case of other religious leader, indeed like Aga Khan or others. And I think it's an important point to make here.
I will help you. I just wanted to make sure we respond to all questions. So I, first of all, thank everyone for wonderful questions. There's one about the Women in Islam conference. I'm not sure if you have received my answers I've written. So there's a handle on Twitter. There's an organization called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, in brief OIC. They have organized it together with the Saudi Arabian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and there are recordings from all sessions, working sessions and opening session on their Twitter handle. So if you just go type OIC, you'll be able to see everything. It's quite well covered, and summary of all speakers. And also I think the organizations themselves will have press releases, as well as all different ministries that have attended it from across the world probably will have some releases from this. So there's lots of information and everything is available if you are interested to look at it.
Thank you. So we have 3 minutes. If any of our panelists want to add in, interject. Yes, Christine.
Yes, I would briefly like to respond to the one question on why SDG 1 and 2, poverty alleviation and no hunger, has not been featured here. It has actually been featured in my book. It's the very first chapter. So if you're interested in that, please have a look at that. It has been taken up from the perspective of the prosperity gospel, which is a certain brand in Christianity, which deals in particular with the issue of prosperity, poverty alleviation in a somewhat ambivalent manner, I would think, but nevertheless a highly interesting way of dealing with these issues. So just as a mentioning. And then, Asa, I do appreciate your emphasis that, of course, it's not only Pope Francis. There are multiple other religious voices who mostly go unheard since they don't have the media attention as the Pope has. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you, Christine. Elizabeth, anything you would like to add?
Maybe just a final note. I do want to encourage you to go and download Christine's book, and also look at the broader series. I think from the authors, from Christine now in this volume, but with the other volumes as well, there's a genuine attempt to grapple with the messiness, and this will always be messy. I think be at peace with that. It will never be clear cut. Humans aren't clear cut, and human religions definitely aren't either. So please, all of the books in the series are open source. So and engage with different religions. So I think there's a real attempt to look at what religions offer these different sustainable development goals. So I do want to encourage you to go and take a look. Thank you.
You. Indeed, and the book is, Christine, you can confirm that accessible online, right? Or downloadable online, I don't, yeah.
Yes, it's accessible online, and drawing attention to other volumes. We're privileged to have two authors of another volume with us. Lisa and Sandra, they did a volume together on religion and violence against women and girls, which is a
Okay.
wonderful volume.
Thank you very much. So we have come to our end, to the end of this, to the end of this session. And first, thank all of you, ladies, for your contributions and for this very lively discussion, and also for all the feedback we got on the Q&A. That were more comments actually than questions as such, but very rich comments. Thank you all, and see you maybe in other settings. Bye bye now.